I still remember the exact sound of Matthew Anderson's coffee mug hitting his mahogany desk when I told him I was taking my $4.7 million idea to his ex-wife's company. The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the air conditioning humming in his corner office overlooking downtown Portland as his face went from dismissive smirk to pure panic in under 3 seconds. 2 weeks earlier, this same man had called my revolutionary marketing algorithm complete garbage and told me to stick to what secretaries do best. He thought he could bury my idea, steal credit for my work, and keep me in my place. What Matthew didn't know was that his ex-wife Celeste had been quietly building the most innovative tech startup in Oregon, and she was about to become my new boss. By the time Matthew realized what was happening, I wasn't just leaving his company. I was taking half his client base with me, and there wasn't a single thing he could do to stop it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the exact texture of the resignation letter between my fingers, crisp white paper that I'd printed on the company's expensive letterhead, my hands trembling slightly as I walked down the polished marble hallway toward Matthew Anderson's corner office on the 42nd floor of the Pinnacle Tower in downtown Portland. The sound of my heels clicking against the marble seemed to echo louder than usual, each step marking the end of 3 years of my life that I was about to leave behind forever. Through the floor-to-ceiling willows, I could see the Willamette River snaking through the city below, and Mount Hood standing majestically in the distance. It was the kind of view that reminded you why Portland was called one of the most beautiful cities in America, the kind of view that made you feel like anything was possible. In exactly 12 minutes, I would discover just how true that was. Matthew's assistant, Jennifer, looked up from her computer as I approached. She'd always been kind to me, one of the few people in the company who treated me like more than just another mid-level employee. "He's in his office, Megan," she said with a sympathetic smile. "Fair warning, he's been in a mood all morning." I nodded, my grip tightening on the letter. Jennifer had no idea what was about to unfold, but she'd been watching the tension between Matthew and me build for weeks. Everyone in the office had noticed the way he'd started dismissing my contributions in meetings, the way he'd begun excluding me from client calls I'd previously led, the way his attitude toward me had shifted from professional respect to something that felt dangerously close to contempt. Matthew's office was exactly what you'd expect from a man who believed his own press releases. Awards lined the walls, expensive art hung precisely at eye level, and his massive mahogany desk sat positioned to catch the maximum amount of natural light while keeping visitors slightly off balance in the shadows. He was on a phone call when I knocked, but he gestured for me to enter with the kind of impatient wave that had become his signature move whenever I needed to speak with him. "I don't care what the client thinks," he was saying into his headset, leaning back in his leather chair with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never had to worry about job security. "We run this account the way we want to run it. They can take it or leave it." He paused, listening, then laughed, a sound that had once seemed confident but now just sounded hollow. "Trust me, they're not going anywhere. Where else are they going to find expertise like ours?" I stood there for nearly 5 minutes, watching him perform what I'd come to recognize as his daily power theater. Matthew Anderson was 48 years old, Harvard MBA, and had been running Pinnacle Marketing Solutions for the past decade. On paper, he was successful. In reality, he was a man so threatened by other people's ideas that he'd rather sabotage them than admit he hadn't thought of them first. When he finally ended his call, he looked at me with the kind of expression you might give to a piece of furniture that had been moved slightly out of place. "What is it, Megan? I've got another call in 10 minutes. "I wanted to give you this personally," I said, extending the resignation letter toward him. For a moment, he just stared at the paper without taking it. Then something shifted in his expression, surprise, maybe, or curiosity. He'd been expecting me to back down, to apologize for challenging him, to quietly accept the way he'd been systematically undermining my work. The resignation letter was clearly not part of his plan. "What's this?" he asked, though we both knew exactly what it was. My resignation, effective immediately. Matthew finally took the letter, his eyes scanning the brief text. I'd kept it professional and minimal. No accusations, no explanations, just the facts. 2 weeks' notice wasn't legally required, but I'd given it anyway, more out of respect for my colleagues than for him. "This is about the algorithm project, isn't it?" he said, setting the letter down on his desk without really reading it. "Look, Megan, I know you're disappointed that we decided to go in a different direction, but that's just business. Sometimes ideas that seem good in theory don't work in practice." It took everything I had not to laugh at his audacity. The algorithm project, my revolutionary approach to predictive customer behavior analysis, hadn't been rejected because it didn't work. It had been rejected because Matthew couldn't stand the idea that his 29-year-old marketing coordinator had developed something that could transform how companies understood their customers. "It's not about disappointment, Matthew," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's about integrity." His face darkened. "Integrity? What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I won't sit quietly while you call my work complete garbage in front of the entire leadership team. It means I won't pretend not to notice when you present my research as your own in client meetings. And it means I definitely won't stick around to watch you assign my project to someone else and take credit for whatever success comes from it." Matthew stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the window with a soft thud. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely rattled. "You're being dramatic, Megan. This is how business works. Ideas belong to the company, not to individuals." "My contract says otherwise," I replied, pulling out my phone. Section 12, subsection C specifically states that innovative concepts developed outside of assigned project parameters remain the intellectual property of the employee unless formally transferred through written agreement. I never signed that transfer. The color drained from Matthew's face. He'd been so focused on dismissing me that he'd forgotten to cover his legal bases. In his arrogance, he'd assumed I would never challenge him, never fight back, never have the courage to walk away. "Where are you going?" he asked, and for the first time his voice carried a note of genuine concern. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Somewhere my ideas will be appreciated. What I didn't tell him, what I couldn't tell him without bursting into laughter, was that I'd already signed a contract with Everly Innovations, the fastest-growing tech startup in Oregon. A company founded and run by Celeste Everly, who happened to be Matthew Anderson's ex-wife. The sound of his coffee mug hitting the desk 12 minutes later, when I called to give him that particular piece of information, would haunt me for weeks. Not because I felt guilty, but because it was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. That moment in Matthew Anderson's office was 3 years in the making. But to understand how I got there, you need to know something about the kind of person I was before I learned to fight back. My name is Megan Smith, and if you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd be sitting here telling you about how I brought down one of Portland's most successful marketing executives, I would have laughed in your face. I grew up in a small farming town called Millfield, Nebraska, population 3,200. Where the biggest scandal was when Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses got mysteriously poisoned the night before the county fair. My parents owned a modest accounting firm that served local farmers and small businesses, and they raised me to believe that hard work, honesty, and keeping your head down were the keys to success. "Don't make waves, Megan," my mother used to say. "Nice girls don't cause trouble." For 26 years of my life, I followed that advice religiously. In high school, I was the student who did everyone else's group project work and let them take equal credit. In college, I was the one who'd stay up all night helping my roommates with their papers, while my own assignments waited until the last minute. When I graduated with a degree in marketing and data analytics from the University of Nebraska, I was valedictorian, but I'd never once stood up for myself in a way that mattered. The decision to move to Portland wasn't born from ambition. It was born from desperation. 3 months after graduation, I was still living in my childhood bedroom, sending out resumes to accounting firms in Omaha and Lincoln, getting rejection letter after rejection letter. The job market in Nebraska for someone with my skills was practically non-existent, and the few positions available paid so little that I'd be living paycheck to paycheck for the foreseeable future. That's when I saw the posting for a junior marketing coordinator position at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions in Portland, Oregon. The salary was double what I could make in Nebraska, and the job description mentioned data-driven marketing strategies and innovative customer analysis. Exactly the kind of work I'd been dreaming about during 4 years of studying outdated marketing textbooks and case studies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I spent my last $600 on a plane ticket to Portland for the interview, staying in a youth hostel that smelled like incense and regret. I'd never been west of the Mississippi River, and walking through downtown Portland felt like stepping into a different world. The buildings were taller than anything in Millfield, the coffee was stronger, and everyone seemed to move with a sense of purpose that I desperately wanted to be part of. The interview at Pinnacle was conducted by Matthew Anderson himself, which should have been my first red flag. Most companies don't have their CEO personally interviewing junior-level candidates unless there's something unusual about the situation. But I was 22, desperate, and completely starstruck by the 40-story office building, the marble lobby, and the fact that someone was actually taking my resume seriously. Matthew was charming in that polished, professional way that successful executives master. He asked thoughtful questions about my academic work, seemed genuinely interested in my thesis on predictive consumer behavior modeling, and even complimented my fresh perspective and innovative thinking. By the time I left his office, I was convinced I'd found my dream job with my dream boss at my dream company. "We need someone who can bring new ideas to our team," he told me as we shook hands at the end of the interview. "Someone who's not afraid to think outside the box and challenge conventional wisdom. I think you might be exactly what we're looking for." I got the job offer 2 days later, and within 3 weeks I'd packed everything I owned into my ancient Honda Civic and driven 1,400 miles to start my new life in Portland. My parents were worried, their small-town daughter moving to a big city where she knew absolutely no one, but they were also proud. I was the first person in our family to work for a major corporation, the first to make a salary with 5 figures, the first to have business cards with my name printed in elegant font. For the first 6 months at Pinnacle, I threw myself into the work with the kind of enthusiasm that probably annoyed my more cynical colleagues. I was the first person in the office every morning and often the last to leave. I read industry publications during my lunch breaks, attended every optional training session, and volunteered for projects that nobody else wanted to touch. Matthew seemed pleased with my dedication. He'd stop by my cubicle to check on my progress, offer feedback on my presentations, and occasionally invite me to sit in on client meetings as a, quote, learning opportunity. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. What I didn't realize was that Matthew Anderson was studying me, learning how I worked, how I thought, and most importantly, how I generated the ideas that were starting to get noticed by our biggest clients. I was so grateful for the opportunity, so eager to prove myself worthy of his faith in me, that I missed all the warning signs of what was really happening. The algorithm that would eventually become worth $4.7 million started as a side project, something I worked on during evenings and weekends because I couldn't stop thinking about better ways to predict customer behavior patterns. I had no idea I was designing my own corporate downfall. The Megan Smith who walked into Pinnacle Marketing Solutions on her first day in September was nothing like the woman who would eventually walk out 3 years later with a multi-million-dollar algorithm and the confidence to take on one of Portland's most powerful executives. I was 22 years old, wearing a navy blue blazer I'd bought at a discount store in Lincoln, and carrying a briefcase that had belonged to my father, a man who'd never worked anywhere more corporate than the Millfield Chamber of Commerce. My cubicle was in the northeast corner of the 38th floor, squeezed between the supply closet and a perpetually broken printer that nobody ever bothered to fix. The space was barely large enough for a desk, a chair, and a filing cabinet, but it had a small window that looked out toward the Columbia River, and on clear days I could see Mount St. Helens in the distance. For a girl who'd grown up looking at nothing but cornfields and grain silos, that view felt like pure magic. My job title was Junior Marketing Coordinator, but what that actually meant was that I did whatever nobody else wanted to do. I organized client files, scheduled meetings, prepared presentation materials, and spent countless hours entering data into spreadsheets that seemed to serve no purpose other than keeping me busy. The work wasn't glamorous, but I attacked every task with the same methodical determination that had gotten me through 4 years of college on academic scholarships. What set me apart from the other junior employees wasn't my ambition. Half the people on my floor had MBA degrees from prestigious schools and family connections that could fast-track their careers. What set me apart was my genuine curiosity about why certain marketing strategies worked, while others failed spectacularly. While my colleagues went out for happy hour drinks after work, I stayed at my desk, analyzing campaign data and looking for patterns that might explain why customer A responded to email marketing while customer B ignored it completely. It was during one of these late-night data deep dives that I first noticed something interesting. Pinnacle had been running a campaign for a major outdoor gear company, targeting customers based on traditional demographics: age, income, geographic location. The results were mediocre at best, with a conversion rate that barely justified the advertising spend. But when I started cross-referencing the successful conversions with other data points, social media activity, purchase timing, even weather patterns, I began to see connections that nobody else had noticed. Customers who bought hiking boots weren't just responding to advertisements about hiking boots. They were responding to a complex web of environmental and behavioral triggers that standard demographic analysis completely missed. Someone might see a hiking boot ad in January and ignore it completely, but show them the same ad 3 days after they'd posted a photo of a mountain landscape on Instagram, and their purchase likelihood increased by 340%. I spent 3 weeks building a preliminary model that could predict these behavioral patterns, working on it during lunch breaks and after hours, because it wasn't part of my assigned responsibilities. When I finally presented my findings to my immediate supervisor, Janet Morrison, she was genuinely intrigued but also worried about overstepping boundaries. "This is impressive work, Megan," she told me, reviewing my analysis in her small office overlooking the building's central courtyard. "But you know, this kind of strategic thinking needs to go through Matthew directly. He's very particular about who gets to propose new methodologies." Janet was a good manager and a decent person, but she'd been at Pinnacle long enough to understand the unwritten rules of corporate survival. Matthew Anderson didn't like surprises, and he definitely didn't like junior employees developing innovative strategies without his direct involvement. The safe thing would have been to file my research away and focus on my assigned tasks, but I couldn't let it go. The potential applications were too significant, and the data was too compelling. I spent another month refining my model, testing it against historical campaign data from 3 different industries, and documenting every methodology and assumption. The results were consistent across every test case. My algorithm could predict customer behavior with 89% accuracy, compared to the industry standard of about 34%. That's when I made my first critical mistake. Instead of approaching Matthew through official channels or scheduling a formal meeting through his assistant, I decided to present my findings during our weekly team meeting, in front of the entire marketing department. I thought I was being proactive and collaborative. What I was actually doing was publicly demonstrating that a junior employee, with no advanced degrees and no corporate experience, had developed something that none of the senior staff had thought of. The meeting was held in Conference Room B, a windowless space on the 40th floor that always smelled faintly of stale coffee and anxiety. Matthew sat at the head of the long table, surrounded by 5 senior marketing managers and 3 vice presidents, all of whom had been with the company for at least 7 years. I was the only person in the room under the age of 35, and definitely the only one wearing a blazer from a discount store. When it was my turn to present, I walked them through my research with the kind of nervous enthusiasm that probably came across as naive rather than professional. I explained how traditional demographic targeting was missing crucial behavioral indicators, showed them the data supporting my conclusions, and demonstrated how my algorithm could increase conversion rates by an average of 278% across different industry sectors. The room was silent when I finished. Not the thoughtful, contemplative kind of silence that suggests people are processing new information, but the uncomfortable, awkward kind of silence that suggests someone has just said something inappropriate at a dinner party. Matthew was the first to speak, and his response would set the tone for everything that followed over the next 3 years. "Interesting theory, Megan," he said, his voice carrying just enough condescension to make it clear that interesting wasn't meant as a compliment. "But I think you might be overcomplicating what is essentially a straightforward process. Marketing isn't about chasing every shiny new trend or trying to revolutionize systems that have been working successfully for decades." He paused, looking around the table to make sure everyone was paying attention to what he said next. "Sometimes the best thing a junior employee can do is focus on mastering the fundamentals before trying to reinvent the wheel." That was the moment I should have recognized what I was really dealing with. But I was 22, optimistic, and still believed that good ideas would eventually be recognized and rewarded, regardless of who proposed them. I had no idea I'd just painted a target on my own back. Matthew Anderson wasn't born into the marketing world. He was practically crowned into it. His grandfather had founded Anderson and Associates in 1962, one of Portland's first major advertising agencies that helped establish the city's reputation as a creative hub for the Pacific Northwest. His father had expanded the business throughout the 1980s and 1990s, building relationships with major corporations that treated the Anderson name like a guarantee of success. When Matthew graduated from Harvard Business School in 2001, he didn't have to job hunt or prove himself in entry-level positions. He simply walked into a senior management role at what had become Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, carrying with him the weight of 2 generations' worth of industry connections and inherited credibility. At 45, Matthew possessed the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having to wonder whether you belong in a room. He was tall, well-dressed in suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who expected others to hang on his every word. His corner office wasn't just a workspace, it was a monument to everything he represented. Awards from industry organizations lined the walls, photographs showed him shaking hands with mayors and CEOs, and his massive desk displayed a collection of crystal paperweights that served no purpose other than to catch light and remind visitors of his status. But Matthew's most defining characteristic wasn't his inherited advantages or his expensive suits. It was his almost pathological need to be the smartest person in every conversation. In client meetings, he had a habit of interrupting presentations to offer improvements that usually amounted to restating what had just been said in slightly different words. During staff meetings, he would listen to proposals with a barely concealed smirk, as if he were a professor grading particularly disappointing student papers. And when employees brought him new ideas, his first instinct was never to evaluate their merit, but rather to find ways to diminish the person presenting them. This became painfully clear during my second month at Pinnacle, when I witnessed Matthew's reaction to a brilliant social media strategy proposed by Sarah Chen, one of our most talented account managers. Sarah had spent weeks developing a campaign that would leverage user-generated content to build authentic brand engagement for a local restaurant chain. Her research was thorough, her strategy was innovative, and her projected results were impressive. Matthew listened to her entire presentation without taking notes, his fingers steepled in front of his face in a pose that suggested deep contemplation, but really conveyed, barely contained impatience. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for nearly 30 seconds, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable for everyone in the room. "Sarah," he finally said, his tone suggesting he was about to deliver difficult news to a slow student. "I appreciate the effort you've put into this, but I think you're missing some fundamental realities about how brand management actually works in the real world." He proceeded to dismantle her strategy piece by piece, not by presenting better alternatives or citing contradictory data, but by questioning her experience, her understanding of sophisticated marketing principles, and her ability to grasp what serious clients actually wanted. By the time he finished, Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, and her innovative campaign had been transformed into what Matthew called a, quote, more traditional, proven approach, which meant basic banner ads and email blasts that any first-year marketing student could have designed. The most insidious part wasn't just that Matthew had rejected a good idea, it was how he'd made Sarah feel grateful for his guidance and ashamed of her own creativity. She actually thanked him for, quote, helping her think more strategically, and promised to focus on fundamentals in future proposals. Watching that interaction, I realized that Matthew's power didn't come from being right. It came from making other people believe they were wrong. What made Matthew particularly dangerous was his ability to disguise his insecurity as mentorship. He had a talent for identifying the most innovative thinkers on his team, and then systematically undermining their confidence, while positioning himself as the wise elder helping them, quote, develop professionally. He would assign promising employees to projects that were doomed to fail, then use those failures as evidence that they weren't ready for more responsibility. He would take credit for successful initiatives while ensuring that any mistakes were traced back to the original proposers. I learned later that this pattern had been playing out at Pinnacle for years. The company had a reputation for hiring bright, ambitious young professionals who would stay for 2 or 3 years before burning out and moving on to other firms. Matthew always framed these departures as natural career progression, evidence that Pinnacle was such a good training ground that other companies constantly tried to poach their talent. In reality, he was systematically destroying the confidence and creativity of anyone who might eventually challenge his authority. The irony was that Matthew's inherited advantages had actually made him less capable, not more. Because he'd never had to prove himself from the ground up, he'd never developed the skills necessary to recognize genuinely innovative thinking when he encountered it. His success had always been based on maintaining existing client relationships and implementing safe, conventional strategies that produced predictable results. The idea that a 22-year-old from Nebraska might develop something that could revolutionize customer behavior analysis wasn't just threatening to his ego, it was incomprehensible to his worldview. During my first 6 months at Pinnacle, I watched Matthew operate with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. He was undeniably successful by conventional measures. The company was profitable, clients generally seemed satisfied, and his reputation in Portland's business community was solid. But I began to notice patterns that suggested his success was built more on avoiding failure than on achieving genuine innovation. Matthew's approach to client management was essentially defensive. Rather than proposing bold new strategies that might transform their businesses, he focused on delivering safe, incremental improvements that protected his relationships while minimizing risk. His team meetings were less about brainstorming creative solutions and more about ensuring that everyone understood the Pinnacle way of doing things, which meant following established protocols and never suggesting anything that might disrupt the comfortable status quo he'd inherited. What I didn't understand at the time was that my enthusiasm for data-driven innovation represented everything Matthew feared most: the possibility that someone without his advantages, someone who hadn't been handed success on a silver platter, might actually be better at his job than he was. That fear would eventually drive him to make decisions that would destroy everything he'd worked to protect. The algorithm that would eventually be worth $4.7 million started as nothing more than a nagging feeling that we were doing everything wrong. Every night as I walked back to my tiny studio apartment in the Hawthorne district, I couldn't stop thinking about all the missed opportunities I'd witnessed that day. Clients spending thousands of dollars on campaigns that barely moved the needle. Brilliant creative work wasted because it was targeting the wrong people at the wrong time. Data sitting in spreadsheets, full of insights that nobody bothered to extract because conventional wisdom said demographics were all that mattered. My apartment was a 400-square-foot space on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house, with slanted ceilings, a kitchenette that barely qualified as functional, and a bathroom I shared with the graduate student who lived across the hall. The rent was $1,200 a month, more than my parents' mortgage payment back in Nebraska, but it was the cheapest place I could find that didn't require a 40-minute commute. My furniture consisted of a futon from Goodwill, a desk I'd assembled from IKEA, and 2 folding chairs that doubled as my dining room set and office meeting space. But that desk became the command center for the most important work of my life. Every evening after dinner, usually something microwavable because I was too exhausted to cook, I would open my laptop and dive into the world of consumer behavior analysis. What started as casual curiosity about customer patterns gradually evolved into something much more systematic and ambitious. I began collecting data from every source I could access: social media APIs, weather databases, economic indicators, demographic surveys, purchase histories, and behavioral studies from academic journals. The initial concept was deceptively simple. Instead of treating customers as static demographic categories, what if we could predict their behavior based on dynamic, real-time factors that actually influenced their decision-making processes? Traditional marketing assumed that a 35-year-old suburban mother would always respond to the same types of messages, regardless of what was happening in her life at that particular moment. But my data suggested something completely different. Always happening P-Rebe always happening P-Rebe Warbe always happening B war were consistent. They were contextual. A 35-year-old suburban mother might ignore advertisements for luxury items 99% of the time, but show her the same ad on the day after her child's soccer team wins a championship, when she's feeling celebratory and generous, and her purchase likelihood increases dramatically. A 28-year-old urban professional might never respond to outdoor gear advertisements, but target him during the 3 days following a stressful work deadline, when he's craving escape and adventure, and suddenly he's researching hiking boots and camping equipment. The challenge was developing a system that could identify and respond to these contextual triggers in real time. This wasn't just about collecting more data. It was about understanding the psychological and emotional patterns that drove consumer behavior, then building algorithms sophisticated enough to recognize when those patterns were converging in ways that created purchase opportunities. I spent my first month mapping correlation patterns between seemingly unrelated variables. Weather data correlated with clothing purchases, but only when combined with specific social media activity indicators. Economic news influenced luxury goods sales, but the impact varied dramatically based on the time of day the news was released and the recipient's recent browsing history. Sports outcomes affected local spending patterns, but only in industries that had no obvious connection to athletics. By December, I was working on the algorithm every night until 2 or 3 a.m., surviving on coffee and the kind of focused intensity that only comes when you're pursuing something that feels genuinely important. My social life, which had never been particularly active anyway, disappeared completely. While my colleagues went out for drinks after work, I would rush home to continue coding. While they spent weekends exploring Portland's famous food scene and outdoor recreation opportunities, I hunched over my laptop, testing mathematical models and refining predictive equations. The breakthrough came during a particularly rainy February weekend when I finally cracked the real-time integration problem. I'd been struggling for weeks to figure out how to process multiple data streams simultaneously without creating system lag that would make the algorithm impractical for actual marketing campaigns. The solution involved a combination of machine learning techniques and statistical modeling that I'd pieced together from academic papers, online forums, and countless hours of trial and error. When I ran the first complete test on historical data from Pinnacle's outdoor gear client, the results were so dramatically better than traditional targeting methods that I initially thought I'd made a calculation error. I spent the entire next day checking and rechecking my work, running the analysis from different angles, testing edge cases and outlier scenarios, but the results remained consistent. My algorithm could predict customer behavior with 89% accuracy, compared to the industry standard of about 34%. The financial implications were staggering. If a company typically spent $100,000 on a marketing campaign that reached 100,000 people with a 3.4% conversion rate, they would generate 3,400 customers. Using my algorithm to target the same budget more precisely, they could reach fewer people but achieve an 89% conversion rate, resulting in potentially 30,000 plus customers from the same investment. The difference wasn't just significant, it was revolutionary. But beyond the numbers, this project represented something much more personal to me. For the first time in my life, I had created something entirely my own, something that could potentially change how businesses understood their customers. This wasn't just about proving myself to Matthew Anderson or advancing my career at Pinnacle. This was about demonstrating that innovative thinking could come from anywhere, that someone without Ivy League credentials or inherited advantages could develop solutions that the established experts had missed. I named the system APEX, Adaptive Predictive Experience Targeting, and by March, I had developed a comprehensive presentation that explained not only how it worked, but how it could be implemented across different industries and scaled for companies of various sizes. The potential applications seemed limitless. Retail companies could optimize inventory based on real-time consumer mood indicators. Restaurants could adjust their menu offerings based on weather and social patterns. Entertainment venues could predict attendance and pricing dynamics weeks in advance. What I didn't anticipate was how threatening this level of innovation would be to someone whose entire career was built on maintaining the status quo. I was about to learn that sometimes the biggest obstacle to success isn't technical complexity or market competition. It's the person who has the power to decide whether your ideas ever see the light of day. The first sign that something had changed came during a routine client meeting in April, 3 weeks after I'd quietly begun testing Apex on small-scale campaigns within my existing project assignments. I'd been careful not to make a big announcement about my algorithm. After the lukewarm reception to my earlier presentation, I decided to let the results speak for themselves. Instead of proposing sweeping changes to company methodology, I was implementing my targeting system in subtle ways, optimizing ad placement timing and audience selection for campaigns that were already approved and running. The results had been remarkable. A struggling fitness center that had been averaging 12 new memberships per month from their digital marketing suddenly jumped to 43 memberships in March. A local boutique clothing store saw their online sales increase by 312% after I adjusted their social media advertising to align with my behavioral prediction models. Most dramatically, a craft brewery that had been hemorrhaging money on ineffective Facebook ads was suddenly booking private events 3 weeks in advance after I optimized their targeting to reach people during specific emotional and social contexts. What made these successes particularly satisfying was that they were happening quietly, without fanfare or special attention. I wasn't asking for recognition or demanding credit. I was simply proving that my approach worked by delivering results that spoke for themselves. Matthew had made it clear that he valued conventional wisdom over innovation, so I decided to let conventional success metrics demonstrate the value of my unconventional methods. That strategy backfired in ways I never could have anticipated. The fitness center meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, with Matthew, myself, and Janet Morrison presenting quarterly results to David Chen, the owner of 3 boutique gyms in the Portland metro area. David had been frustrated with Pinnacle's services for months. His membership numbers were declining, his marketing costs were increasing, and he was seriously considering switching to a different agency. This meeting was essentially our last chance to prove that we could deliver the growth he needed. I'd prepared a detailed analysis showing how the new targeting approach had tripled his membership acquisition rate while actually reducing his advertising spend by 18%. The data was clean, the methodology was sound, and the results were undeniable. David was going to see exactly how much value Pinnacle was providing, and hopefully that would secure our relationship for another year. But when we walked into the conference room, Matthew was carrying a presentation folder that I'd never seen before. "David," Matthew said, settling into his chair with the kind of confident smile that usually preceded good news. "I think you're going to be very pleased with what we've accomplished for your business over the past quarter." He opened his presentation, and my stomach dropped. Every chart, every graph, every data point I had prepared was there, but my name was nowhere to be found. Instead, the presentation header read, "Pinnacle's Enhanced Strategic Targeting Initiative," with Matthew Anderson listed as the primary strategist, and Janet Morrison as the implementation coordinator. My 3 months of evening and weekend work, my innovative algorithm, my carefully documented methodology, all of it was being presented as if Matthew himself had developed and executed the entire approach. "Our enhanced targeting strategy," Matthew continued, clearly enjoying David's impressed reaction to the membership numbers, "represents a significant evolution in how we understand consumer behavior. By integrating multiple data streams and applying advanced predictive modeling, we've been able to identify high-value prospects with unprecedented precision." David was nodding enthusiastically, asking questions about how the system worked and whether it could be applied to his other business ventures. Matthew answered with the kind of detailed technical knowledge that suggested he'd studied my work extensively, memorizing my explanations and methodology so thoroughly that he could present them as his own insights. I sat there in stunned silence, watching 3 months of my intellectual property being stolen in real time. Every question David asked, every compliment he offered, every expression of renewed confidence in Pinnacle's capabilities, all of it was being directed toward Matthew, who was accepting the credit with the casual entitlement of someone who believed he deserved it. When the meeting ended and David left with promises to renew his contract and refer other gym owners to our services, Matthew turned to me with what he probably thought was a generous smile. "Good work on the execution, Megan," he said, as if he were complimenting a competent secretary on her filing skills. "It's always satisfying when solid strategic planning translates into measurable results." That evening, I found myself walking through Laurelhurst Park in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. The cherry trees were blooming, families were having picnics on the grass, and the world seemed to be carrying on normally while my professional reality had just been turned upside down. I'd spent months developing something genuinely innovative, something that could transform how businesses understood their customers. And my boss had simply taken it and presented it as his own work. But what bothered me even more than the theft itself was how smoothly Matthew had executed it. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision to claim credit for someone else's work. This was a calculated plan that had been weeks in the making. He'd been watching my results, studying my methods, and preparing to appropriate my intellectual property long before that client meeting ever took place. Over the following weeks, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Other clients started receiving presentations about Pinnacle's revolutionary new targeting capabilities, always delivered by Matthew with Janet providing supporting details. My algorithm was being applied to campaigns across different industries, generating impressive results that were transforming our clients' businesses and significantly increasing their satisfaction with our services. Meanwhile, my role in these successes was being systematically erased. When clients asked about the technical details behind our improved performance, Matthew would defer to quote, our data analytics team without ever mentioning specific names. When industry publications wrote articles about Pinnacle's innovative approaches, Matthew was quoted extensively as the visionary leader driving the company's evolution, while the actual developers of those innovations remained anonymous. The most infuriating part was that Matthew seemed to genuinely believe he deserved credit for my work. During team meetings, he would talk about, quote, our enhanced methodology and the strategic insights we've developed, with the kind of pride that suggested he'd forgotten who had actually created the system he was profiting from. He'd begun referring to Apex as the Pinnacle Advantage and had started developing plans to license our targeting capabilities to other marketing firms, a move that could potentially generate millions in additional revenue. By June, it became clear that Matthew wasn't just stealing credit for my past work. He was positioning himself to control my future innovations as well. He'd begun requiring me to submit all research findings and methodology documentation through official channels, ostensibly for quality control and strategic alignment purposes. Any insights I developed were now automatically classified as company intellectual property, with Matthew serving as the sole arbiter of how those insights would be implemented and promoted. But the most ominous development came during my annual performance review, when Matthew delivered what he clearly thought was encouraging feedback about my career trajectory. You've shown real growth this year, Megan, he told me, leaning back in his chair with the kind of paternal smile that felt more threatening than reassuring. I think you're finally starting to understand how marketing strategy works at the enterprise level. With continued focus on execution and implementation, you could have a very promising future here at Pinnacle. The message was crystal clear. As long as I remained content to execute other people's strategies and implement other people's innovations, I would be valued and protected. But if I ever tried to claim ownership of my own ideas or challenge his authority to appropriate my work, I would discover just how quickly a promising future could disappear. I walked out of that review knowing that my time at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions was approaching an end. The only question was whether I would leave quietly, allowing Matthew to continue profiting from my innovations, or whether I would find a way to fight back. What I didn't know was that the perfect opportunity for revenge was sitting in an office just 12 blocks away, planning her own comeback against the man who had once promised to love, honor, and respect her. September 15th was supposed to be the most important day of my career at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. After months of watching Matthew present my work as his own innovations, I'd finally found a way to reclaim ownership of my algorithm while staying within the bounds of my employment contract. Tech Northwest, the region's most prestigious business conference, had accepted my proposal to present a case study on revolutionary predictive analytics in modern marketing, a presentation that would demonstrate Apex's capabilities to an audience of 500 industry leaders, potential clients, and media representatives. The conference acceptance letter had arrived in my personal email, addressed specifically to me as an individual researcher rather than as a Pinnacle employee. This distinction was crucial. While my employment contract gave Matthew rights to any work I performed for company clients, it didn't prevent me from presenting academic research at industry conferences. I'd been careful to frame my submission as an independent analysis of consumer behavior patterns, using anonymized data that didn't reference specific Pinnacle campaigns or client information. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a path forward that didn't require me to watch someone else take credit for my intellectual property. The presentation would establish me as the actual creator of the targeting methodology that had been transforming our clients' businesses. Industry publications would quote me directly. Potential employers would see my innovation firsthand. Most importantly, Matthew would no longer be able to claim that he'd developed the strategic insights that were generating millions of dollars in value for our clients. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing the most comprehensive presentation of my career. 27 slides that walked through the mathematical foundations of behavioral prediction, the technological infrastructure required for real-time data integration, and case studies demonstrating the algorithm's effectiveness across different industry sectors. I'd practiced the presentation dozens of times, timing each section to maximize impact while staying within the 45-minute time limit. The night before the conference, I'd laid out my best professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit I'd purchased specifically for this occasion, and triple-checked that my laptop contained backup copies of every file I would need. I'd even printed hard copies of my slides and notes, just in case of technical difficulties. This presentation wasn't just about advancing my career. It was about proving to myself that I could compete at the highest levels of my industry without hiding behind someone else's reputation. I should have known that Matthew would never allow that to happen. The first sign of trouble came at 6:30 a.m., when I arrived at the convention center to set up for my 9:15 a.m. presentation slot. The registration desk couldn't find my name on the speaker list, despite the fact that I'd received multiple confirmation emails over the past 3 weeks. After 20 minutes of increasingly frantic phone calls, the conference coordinator finally located my information. But there had been a scheduling conflict that required my presentation to be moved to a smaller breakout room during the lunch hour, when most attendees would be networking rather than attending sessions. "I'm sorry about the confusion," the coordinator explained, clearly uncomfortable with delivering bad news. "We received a call yesterday from someone at your company requesting the change. Something about conflicting priorities and resource allocation?" My blood ran cold. Matthew had somehow intervened with the conference organizers, using his industry connections to sabotage my presentation without technically canceling it. Moving my session to lunch hour in a breakout room meant that instead of reaching 500 industry leaders, I'd be speaking to maybe 30 people in a space designed for intimate discussions rather than major presentations. But I was determined to proceed anyway. Even 30 people was better than none, and my research was strong enough to make an impact regardless of the venue size. I spent the morning attending other sessions and networking with potential contacts, building anticipation for my afternoon presentation among the people I met. That's when the second wave of problems began. At 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before I was scheduled to begin setting up in the breakout room, I received an urgent phone call from Jennifer, Matthew's assistant. There had been a critical client emergency at Pinnacle that required my immediate attention. One of our largest accounts was threatening to terminate their contract unless I personally addressed concerns about their current campaign performance. "Matthew tried to handle it himself," Jennifer explained, her voice tight with stress. "But they specifically asked for you. They said you're the only one who understands their targeting strategy well enough to fix whatever's going wrong." The timing was impossibly suspicious. In 3 years at Pinnacle, I'd never received an emergency call that couldn't wait a few hours for resolution. But the client Jennifer mentioned, Morrison Industries, a manufacturing company that represented nearly $800,000 in annual revenue, was exactly the kind of account that could justify pulling me away from a conference presentation. I was trapped between two impossible choices: abandon my career-defining presentation to handle a client crisis that might be fabricated, or ignore a potential emergency that could cost Pinnacle hundreds of thousands of dollars and provide Matthew with grounds for disciplinary action. I chose the client. Racing back to the Pinnacle office, I discovered that the critical emergency was a minor reporting discrepancy that could have been resolved with a 5-minute phone call. The client wasn't threatening to leave, wasn't dissatisfied with their campaign performance, and had never specifically requested my involvement. By the time I realized I'd been deceived, my conference presentation slot had already passed. But the worst revelation was still to come. When I returned to my desk to salvage what remained of my day, I found an email from Tech Northwest's media coordinator thanking me for yesterday's last-minute presentation topic change. Attached was a press release announcing that Matthew Anderson, CEO of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, had delivered a groundbreaking presentation on revolutionary predictive analytics in modern marketing to a standing room-only audience in the main conference hall. My presentation, my research, my algorithm, delivered by Matthew to the exact audience I'd been supposed to reach, using slides that were clearly based on my work but presented as his original innovations. The press release quoted Matthew extensively. This predictive targeting methodology represents the future of customer relationship management. By integrating real-time behavioral data with advanced mathematical modeling, we've developed a system that can identify purchase intentions with unprecedented accuracy. Sitting at my desk, staring at that press release, I finally understood the full scope of what Matthew had been planning. This wasn't just casual credit stealing or opportunistic appropriation of my ideas. This was a calculated campaign to establish himself as the industry expert on predictive marketing analytics, using my intellectual property as the foundation for his reputation, while systematically erasing any evidence that I had been involved in developing the technology. The algorithm I'd created in my tiny apartment, working late into the night for months, was now being positioned as Matthew Anderson's signature innovation. The methodology that could revolutionize how businesses understood their customers was being presented to potential licensing partners as Pinnacle's proprietary competitive advantage, with Matthew as the visionary leader who'd guided its development. But what infuriated me most wasn't the theft itself. It was the realization that Matthew had been planning this appropriation for months, carefully maneuvering to ensure that when the time came to present my work to the industry, he would be the one standing at the podium while I was trapped in a fabricated crisis of his own creation. That evening, as I sat in my apartment researching intellectual property attorneys and trying to figure out whether I had any legal recourse, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and intriguingly familiar. "Miss Smith, this is Celeste Everly from Everly Innovations. I was in the audience for Matthew Anderson's presentation today, and I think we need to talk." "Miss Smith, this is Celeste Everly from Everly Innovations. I was in the audience for Matthew Anderson's presentation today, and I think we need to talk." The name hit me like a physical force. Celeste Everly, Matthew's ex-wife, though he'd never mentioned her name directly in the 3 years I'd worked for him. I only knew about their connection through office gossip and the occasional bitter comment he'd make about people who think they can succeed by riding on other people's coattails. The irony of that particular criticism was now almost laughable. "I'm sorry," I said, setting down the glass of wine I'd been using to numb the frustration of watching my career get hijacked. "Did you say you were at the conference today?" I was indeed. Sitting in the third row, watching Matthew present what I can only assume was your work on predictive analytics. Her voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, and an undertone of controlled anger that suggested she was as furious about the situation as I was. The presentation was impressive, but I know Matthew well enough to recognize when he's trying to claim credit for innovations that are far beyond his actual capabilities. I felt something loosen in my chest, the first hint of validation I'd experienced in months. "What makes you think it was my work?" Because 6 months ago, Matthew tried to poach one of my senior developers by bragging about a brilliant young analyst who was revolutionizing customer behavior prediction at Pinnacle. He described your algorithm in enough detail that I immediately recognized it in today's presentation. The mathematical approach, the real-time data integration, the behavioral trigger mapping. That's not Matthew's thinking. That's someone with genuine technical innovation skills. Celeste Everly had founded Everly Innovations 3 years earlier, after her divorce from Matthew, and had built it into one of Portland's fastest-growing technology consulting firms. While Matthew had inherited his position and spent his career implementing safe, conventional strategies, Celeste had started from scratch and earned her reputation by developing cutting-edge solutions for companies that needed to adapt quickly to changing markets. "Ms. Everly," I said, suddenly aware that I was speaking to someone who could potentially offer me a way out of the trap Matthew had constructed around my career. "I appreciate you calling, but I'm not sure what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that you deserve better than watching someone else profit from your intellectual property. And I'm also suggesting that you might be interested in working for a company that actually values innovation over ego management." We talked for another 40 minutes. Celeste explained how she'd built Everly Innovations, specifically to attract the kind of talented professionals who were being stifled by traditional corporate hierarchies. Her client base included startups that needed rapid growth strategies, established companies that wanted to modernize their customer engagement approaches, and investors who were looking for the next breakthrough in consumer behavior analysis. Your algorithm, she said, could be worth millions to the right clients. But more importantly, it represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach that separates successful companies from ones that are just coasting on past achievements. By the end of our conversation, I had a decision to make. I could continue working at Pinnacle, watching Matthew present my innovations as his own while I remained invisible in the background, or I could take a leap of faith with someone who seemed to understand the value of what I'd created. There's one thing I need to tell you, Celeste said as we were wrapping up the call. Matthew doesn't know I was at the conference today, and he definitely doesn't know that I'm aware of how he's been treating his employees' intellectual property. If you decide to join my company, that conversation is going to be interesting. The next morning, I walked into Pinnacle with my resignation letter already drafted and a signed offer letter from Everly Innovations in my briefcase. But before I submitted my resignation, I wanted to give Matthew one final opportunity to acknowledge what he'd done and perhaps salvage some shred of professional dignity. I knocked on his office door at 10:30 a.m. after his regular morning call with the company's board of directors. He was reviewing what looked like licensing agreements, presumably contracts related to the Pinnacle Advantage methodology that was built entirely on my stolen work. Matthew, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk, I wanted to talk to you about yesterday's presentation at Tech Northwest. His face lit up with the kind of satisfaction that comes from public recognition and industry validation. It went very well, he said, leaning back in his chair. The response was overwhelmingly positive. I think we're positioned to license our targeting technology to consulting firms throughout the Pacific Northwest. Our targeting technology? The Pinnacle Advantage system, he clarified, as if the name he'd invented somehow legitimized his appropriation of my work. The predictive analytics methodology we've developed over the past year. I felt a familiar surge of anger, but this time it was accompanied by something new: clarity. For months, I'd been trying to find ways to work within Matthew's system, to prove my value, while accommodating his need to control and claim credit for everything his employees accomplished. But sitting in his office, listening to him describe my algorithm as if he'd personally developed every mathematical equation and behavioral insight, I realized that accommodation was impossible. Matthew, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the recording app I'd started before entering his office. I need you to explain something to me. Yesterday morning, you told the conference coordinator that there was a scheduling conflict that required my presentation to be moved. Then you had Jennifer call me with a fabricated client emergency to ensure I couldn't attend my own session. Then you presented my research, slides that were clearly based on my work, as your own innovations. I'm trying to understand the thought process behind those decisions. The color drained from Matthew's face. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely rattled, caught between his instinct to deny everything and his realization that I had evidence of his deception. Megan, he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he wanted to make someone feel small and unreasonable. I think you're misunderstanding how intellectual property works in a corporate environment. When employees develop innovations using company resources and company time, those innovations belong to the company. I was simply presenting Pinnacle's technological capabilities to potential partners. Using company resources? I stood up, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain professional. I developed that algorithm in my apartment, on my own time, using my own equipment. I never signed any intellectual property transfer agreements. And you didn't present it as Pinnacle's work. You presented it as Matthew Anderson's personal innovation. Matthew's expression shifted from defensive to openly hostile. Are you threatening me, Megan? Because I'd hate to think that one of my employees was planning to make false accusations about... I'm not one of your employees anymore, I interrupted, pulling my resignation letter from my briefcase and placing it on his desk. Effective immediately. For a moment, the only sound in the office was the humming of his computer, and the distant noise of traffic 40 floors below. Matthew stared at the resignation letter, as if it were written in a foreign language. "Where are you going?" he asked, and for the first time his voice carried a note of genuine concern rather than manufactured authority. I smiled, feeling a sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced since my first day at Pinnacle 3 years earlier. Somewhere my ideas will be appreciated. I turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at him one final time. "Oh, and Matthew? You might want to call Celeste. She has some thoughts about your presentation yesterday that I think you'll find very illuminating." The sound of his coffee mug hitting his mahogany desk as I closed the door behind me was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in months. Walking out of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions for the last time should have felt like a defeat. I was leaving behind 3 years of career development, a steady salary that had finally allowed me to move out of my tiny studio apartment, and the security of working for an established company with recognizable clients. Most 25-year-olds don't voluntarily abandon stable employment to join a startup founded by their former boss's ex-wife, especially when that decision is based on a single phone conversation and a leap of faith. But as I stood on the sidewalk outside the Pinnacle Tower, holding a cardboard box containing the few personal items I'd been allowed to take from my desk, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement about my professional future. Celeste had asked me to meet her at Everley Innovations' offices in the Pearl District the following morning, giving me exactly 18 hours to process what I'd just done and prepare for what might be the most important job interview of my life. Instead of spending that time second-guessing my decision or worrying about the financial risks of leaving stable employment, I used those 18 hours to do what I did best: analyze data and develop strategy. I spent the evening in my apartment, a one-bedroom place in the Alberta district that I'd finally been able to afford after my last promotion, mapping out everything I knew about Everley Innovations, Celeste's business philosophy, and the competitive landscape they were operating in. What I discovered was fascinating and encouraging in equal measure. Everley Innovations had been founded 3 years earlier, with $2.3 million in seed funding from a combination of angel investors and Celeste's personal resources from her divorce settlement. Unlike Pinnacle, which focused on serving large corporate clients with traditional marketing strategies, Everley specialized in helping mid-market companies, businesses with 50 to 500 employees that were too large for basic marketing solutions but too small to afford the premium services offered by major consulting firms. This market positioning was brilliant for several reasons. Mid-market companies were exactly the type of businesses that could benefit most from innovative targeting technologies like my algorithm. They had enough customers to generate meaningful data patterns, but not so many that they required the massive infrastructure investments that enterprise-level solutions demanded. They were also more willing to experiment with new approaches because they couldn't afford to waste money on ineffective conventional strategies. Even more importantly, Celeste had built her team by recruiting talented professionals who had been undervalued or overlooked by traditional consulting firms. Her senior staff included a former Google product manager who had left because she wanted more creative control over her projects, a data scientist who had been passed over for promotion at 3 different Fortune 500 companies despite consistently delivering breakthrough insights, and a business development director who had built his previous employer's most successful client relationships before being pushed out in a corporate restructuring. These were people who understood what it felt like to have their contributions minimized or their innovations appropriated by others. They had chosen to work for Everley not because it offered the highest salaries or the most prestigious brand recognition, but because it promised something more valuable: the opportunity to do meaningful work that would be properly credited and rewarded. The next morning, I arrived at Everley's offices 20 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained detailed documentation of my algorithm's development, performance metrics from the Pinnacle campaigns where it had been implemented, and a comprehensive business plan for how predictive analytics could be integrated into Everley's service offerings. I'd spent 3 hours preparing the presentation, drawing on everything I'd learned about effective client communication during my time at Pinnacle. But what struck me immediately upon entering Everley's workspace was how different the culture felt compared to Pinnacle's corporate formality. The office occupied 2 floors of a converted warehouse building, with exposed brick walls, industrial lighting, and an open floor plan that encouraged collaboration rather than hierarchy. Instead of individual offices that reinforced status distinctions, the space featured collaborative work areas, comfortable seating arrangements for informal meetings, and whiteboards covered with project timelines and brainstorming sessions. Celeste greeted me in the main conference room, which had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River and Mount Hood in the distance. She was 43 years old, with prematurely gray hair that she wore in a sophisticated bob, and sharp green eyes that suggested she missed very little of what happened around her. She dressed in a style that was professional but not corporate: dark jeans, a tailored blazer, and boots that looked like they were designed for both boardroom meetings and weekend hiking trips. "Before we talk about your algorithm," she said, settling into a chair across from me with a cup of coffee and a legal pad covered in handwritten notes, "I want to understand something about your experience at Pinnacle." Matthew presented your work as his own innovation, but he also could have simply buried it entirely. Why do you think he chose to steal credit rather than suppress the technology altogether? The question revealed something important about how Celeste approached business problems. She wasn't just interested in what had happened. She wanted to understand the psychological and strategic motivations that had driven Matthew's decisions. This was someone who thought systematically about human behavior and competitive dynamics. "Because the results were too impressive to ignore," I replied. "My algorithm was generating conversion rates that were 3 to 4 times higher than industry standards." Matthew couldn't suppress that kind of performance without risking client relationships and revenue targets. But he also couldn't allow me to receive credit for developing something that revolutionary, because it would have undermined his authority and exposed how limited his own strategic thinking actually was. Celeste nodded, making notes on her legal pad. So he was trapped between his ego and his business interests, and he chose to try to satisfy both by stealing credit for your work. Exactly. And I think he assumed I would accept the situation because I needed the job and didn't have anywhere else to go. But you did have somewhere else to go, Celeste said with a slight smile. You just didn't know it yet. We spent the next 2 hours walking through my algorithm in detail. Celeste asked technical questions that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of data analytics and predictive modeling. But she also pushed me to think about practical implementation challenges that I hadn't fully considered. How would the system handle seasonal variations in consumer behavior? What kind of data privacy protections would be necessary to comply with evolving regulations? How could the technology be scaled to work for clients in different industries without requiring completely customized development? These were exactly the kinds of strategic questions that Matthew had never bothered to ask, and answering them helped me refine my own understanding of how my innovation could be transformed into a sustainable business advantage. But the most important part of our conversation came when Celeste explained her vision for how my algorithm would fit into Everly's broader service offerings. Traditional consulting firms like Pinnacle sell their clients on proven methodologies and established best practices, she said, sketching a diagram on the whiteboard that showed the relationship between innovation, implementation, and results. That approach works well for large corporations that need predictable outcomes and minimal risk. But mid-market companies need something different. They need innovations that can give them competitive advantages against larger rivals. She turned to face me directly. Your predictive analytics technology isn't just a better way to target advertisements. It's a way for smaller companies to compete with enterprises that have much larger marketing budgets. A boutique retailer using your algorithm can achieve customer acquisition results that rival what Target or Amazon accomplish, because they're targeting more precisely rather than more broadly. This was the first time anyone had articulated the strategic value of my work in terms that went beyond simple performance metrics. Matthew had been focused on how my algorithm could improve Pinnacle's service delivery and client satisfaction. Celeste was thinking about how it could transform the competitive dynamics of entire industries. The offer I'm prepared to make, she continued, includes a base salary that's 40% higher than what you were earning at Pinnacle, plus equity participation that could be worth millions if we successfully scale this technology. But more importantly, you would be joining as a partner, not an employee. Your name would be on our marketing materials, your innovations would be credited to you personally, and you would have decision-making authority over how your technology is developed and implemented. The financial terms were impressive, but what really convinced me was the recognition factor. After 3 years of watching Matthew claim credit for my ideas, The prospect of working somewhere that would actually acknowledge my contributions felt almost revolutionary. "There's one more thing," Celeste said as we concluded our meeting. "Matthew doesn't know that you're here, and he doesn't know that I'm aware of how he's been appropriating your work. When we officially announce your partnership with Everly, and when our clients start seeing the results your algorithm can deliver, he's going to realize that he's lost not just a talented employee, but the competitive advantage that was driving Pinnacle's recent success." She paused, studying my expression. "Are you prepared for the conversation that's going to happen when he figures out what he's lost?" I thought about that question as I walked back to my car, carrying a signed partnership agreement that would change the trajectory of my entire career. Matthew had spent months positioning himself as the visionary leader behind Pinnacle's innovative targeting capabilities. He had presented my algorithm to industry conferences, pitched licensing deals to potential partners, and built his professional reputation on technologies that he had neither developed nor truly understood. But algorithms are only as valuable as the people who can implement and improve them. Matthew had stolen credit for my past innovations, but he couldn't steal my ability to create future ones. By forcing me out of Pinnacle, he had eliminated his access to the person who actually understood how predictive analytics worked and how they could be evolved to meet changing market demands. In trying to suppress my contributions and claim ownership of my intellectual property, Matthew had made the classic mistake of focusing on short-term ego gratification rather than long-term strategic advantage. He had won a temporary victory by stealing credit for my algorithm, but he had lost the war by driving away the person who could continue developing breakthrough innovations. Standing in the Pearl District, looking up at the Everly Innovations sign on the building that would soon house my first real office, I realized that Matthew's betrayal had actually been the best thing that could have happened to my career. At Pinnacle, I would always have been limited by his insecurities and constrained by his need to control and diminish other people's achievements. At Everly, I would have the resources, support, and recognition necessary to transform my predictive analytics work from a stolen innovation into an industry-changing technology platform. Matthew had taught me an invaluable lesson about corporate politics and intellectual property protection. But more importantly, he had forced me to discover exactly how much I was capable of achieving when I stopped trying to work within other people's limitations and started building something entirely my own. The $4.7 million algorithm he had dismissed as garbage was about to become the foundation for a business empire that would make Pinnacle marketing solutions look like a quaint relic of outdated thinking. And the best part was that he still had no idea what was coming. 6 months after joining Everly Innovations as a full partner, I was sitting in a conference room overlooking Pioneer Courthouse Square, presenting my predictive analytics technology to the executive team of Northwest Regional Bank, a mid-market financial institution with 127 branches across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. The presentation had gone flawlessly, the Q&A session had revealed genuine excitement about the potential applications, and I was about to close the largest single contract of my career. "Ms. Smith," said Rebecca Torres, the bank's chief marketing officer, "the results you're projecting seem almost too good to be true. A 340% improvement in customer acquisition efficiency? How confident are you that your algorithm can deliver those numbers in the financial services sector?" I smiled, pulling up a slide that showed real-world performance data from the past 6 months. "Let me show you exactly what we've accomplished for our existing clients." The numbers spoke for themselves. Everly Innovations had signed 14 new clients since I joined the company, ranging from boutique retailers to regional manufacturing companies to technology startups seeking rapid growth. In every single case, my Apex algorithm had exceeded the performance projections I'd made during the initial sales presentations. Mountain Peak Outfitters, a regional outdoor gear retailer, had seen their online conversion rates increase from 2.8% to 11.3% within 3 months of implementing my targeting system. Pacific Northwest Coffee Roasters had reduced their customer acquisition costs by 67%, while simultaneously doubling their subscription signups. Most dramatically, Cascade Construction had identified $2.3 million in new business opportunities by using predictive analytics to understand when their existing clients were most likely to need additional services. But the real validation had come from sources I hadn't expected. Industry publications were starting to write articles about the Everly advantage, and the innovative approaches that were helping mid-market companies compete with much larger rivals. Portland Business Journal had featured me on their 40 under 40 inches list, specifically citing my work in democratizing advanced analytics for growing businesses. TechCrunch had published a profile of Everly Innovations that described my algorithm as the kind of breakthrough that could reshape how companies understand customer behavior. What made these accolades particularly satisfying was that they were based on my actual work, properly attributed and accurately described. After 3 years of watching Matthew claim credit for my innovations, the experience of reading articles that quoted me directly and acknowledged my contributions felt almost surreal. The Northwest Regional Bank contract, when we finally signed it 2 weeks later, was worth $1.8 million annually, larger than any single account I'd worked on during my entire tenure at Pinnacle. But more importantly, it represented validation that my algorithm could deliver transformational results across different industries and at significant scale. Rebecca Torres called me personally the day after we implemented the system for their first marketing campaign. "Megan," she said, and I could hear genuine amazement in her voice, "we've been trying to crack the millennial banking market for 3 years. Your targeting system identified 47,000 potential customers in our service area that our traditional demographic analysis had completely missed. We're seeing account opening rates that are 5 times higher than anything we've achieved before." But while Everly Innovations was experiencing unprecedented growth, Matthew Anderson was discovering the true cost of his decision to appropriate my intellectual property and drive me away from Pinnacle. The first crack in his carefully constructed facade appeared in November, when Morrison Industries, the manufacturing client whose emergency had prevented me from presenting at Tech Northwest, called an emergency meeting to discuss declining performance in their marketing campaigns. The targeting system that had been generating impressive results for months was suddenly producing conversion rates that were barely above industry averages. The problem was that Matthew had never actually understood how my algorithm worked. He could present the results and explain the general concepts, but he had no idea how to troubleshoot problems, optimize performance, or adapt the system to changing market conditions. When Morrison Industries' customer behavior patterns shifted due to seasonal factors that my original implementation hadn't accounted for, Matthew's team was completely unable to adjust the targeting parameters accordingly. "What we're seeing," explained David Morrison during a tense conference call that I learned about through industry contacts, "is that your revolutionary targeting system seems to have stopped working. Our conversion rates have dropped by 60% over the past month, and nobody at Pinnacle can explain why or how to fix it." Matthew's response, according to sources who were in the room, was to blame external factors: changes in social media algorithms, shifts in consumer behavior due to economic uncertainty, increased competition from companies that were, copying Pinnacle's innovative approaches. What he couldn't explain was why other companies using similar predictive analytics, specifically companies that were working with Everly Innovations, weren't experiencing the same performance degradation. The Morrison Industries situation triggered a cascade of similar problems with other Pinnacle clients. The targeting system that Matthew had been presenting as his signature innovation was essentially a snapshot of my algorithm from September, frozen in time without the ongoing optimization and refinement that was necessary to maintain its effectiveness. While I was continuously improving Apex based on new data insights and changing market conditions, Matthew was stuck with a static system that he didn't understand well enough to modify or improve. By January, Pinnacle had lost 4 major clients, including Morrison Industries and the outdoor gear company whose success had originally caught Celeste's attention. Each departure followed the same pattern: declining performance from the targeting system, Matthew's inability to provide technical solutions, and the client's growing awareness that other companies were achieving better results with more sophisticated approaches. But the most devastating blow to Matthew's reputation came from an unexpected source: the licensing deals he had been negotiating based on my stolen algorithm. Columbia Marketing Partners, a Seattle-based consulting firm, had signed a $500,000 agreement to license Pinnacle's proprietary targeting methodology for their own client base. The contract included performance guarantees and technical support commitments that Matthew had agreed to without fully understanding the implications. When Columbia's implementation of the Pinnacle system failed to deliver the promised results, they demanded detailed technical documentation and hands-on troubleshooting support. Matthew's team, lacking the expertise to provide either, was forced to admit that they couldn't fulfill the technical support requirements they had contractually guaranteed. The resulting legal dispute became public when Columbia marketing partners filed a lawsuit alleging fraudulent misrepresentation and breach of contract. The lawsuit documents, which became available through public records requests, included email exchanges that revealed the extent to which Matthew had misrepresented his understanding of the targeting technology he was trying to license. Mr. Anderson's company appears to have licensed a technology that they do not actually possess the expertise to support or maintain, Columbia's attorney told Portland Business Journal. Our technical analysis suggests that the algorithms they provided are significantly outdated compared to what's currently available in the market, and they lack the institutional knowledge necessary to implement them effectively. The article sparked further investigation by other industry publications. TechCrunch published a follow-up piece that compared Pinnacle's declining performance with Everly Innovations' growing success, noting that several former Pinnacle clients had switched to working with my company after experiencing disappointing results with their original service provider. The contrast is striking, the article noted. While Pinnacle Marketing Solutions appears to be struggling with client retention and performance issues, Everly Innovations has become Portland's fastest-growing marketing technology firm, with client testimonials praising their, quote, cutting-edge predictive analytics and, quote, exceptional technical expertise. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came in March, when I received a call from David Chen, the fitness center owner who had been my first successful implementation of Apex back when I was still working at Pinnacle. "Megan," he said, "I hope you don't mind me calling you directly, but I need to ask you something. The marketing campaigns that worked so well for my gyms last year have completely stopped performing. Matthew keeps telling me that market conditions have changed, but I've been talking to other gym owners who are working with different consultants, and they're still seeing great results. I'm wondering if you might be able to help me figure out what's going wrong." I explained that I was no longer with Pinnacle and was now working with Everly Innovations, developing advanced analytics solutions for mid-market companies like his gym business. David's response was immediate and decisive. "Can we set up a meeting? I think it's time for me to make a change." David's contract with Pinnacle included a 90-day termination clause that allowed him to switch service providers with appropriate notice. Within 4 months, his gym membership numbers had returned to their previous growth trajectory, and he was referring other fitness center owners to Everly Innovations. The pattern repeated itself throughout the spring and summer. Clients who had experienced declining performance with Pinnacle's targeting system were quietly reaching out to Everly Innovations, either directly or through referrals from other business owners who had made the switch. In many cases, these were clients who had initially been attracted to Pinnacle because of the impressive results they had heard about from my algorithm implementations. By August, exactly 1 year after Matthew had stolen my conference presentation and appropriated my intellectual property, Everly Innovations had grown from a 12-person startup to a 34-employee company, with annual revenue approaching $8 million. My Apex algorithm was now being used by 67 different companies across 7 industries, generating an average improvement in marketing performance of 312%, compared to traditional demographic targeting approaches. Most importantly, the algorithm's value had been formally assessed by an independent technology valuation firm as part of our Series A funding round. Their analysis concluded that my predictive analytics platform, including all associated intellectual property and ongoing development potential, was worth $4.7 million, exactly the number that had appeared in my original pitch to Matthew back when he had dismissed my work as complete garbage. The Series A funding round, led by a venture capital firm that specialized in marketing technology investments, raised $12 million for Everly Innovations and valued the company at $45 million. As a founding partner with significant equity participation, my personal stake in the company was suddenly worth more than I had expected to earn in my entire career when I was still working at Pinnacle. Meanwhile, Matthew was struggling to explain to Pinnacle's board of directors why the company had lost 9 major clients in 8 months, why their licensing deals were failing, and why their, quote, proprietary technology advantage seemed to have evaporated, along with their market reputation. The board's investigation, according to industry sources, had uncovered the extent to which Pinnacle's recent success had been dependent on innovations developed by a single employee, an employee whose departure had effectively eliminated the company's competitive advantage in the predictive analytics market. Matthew was quietly asked to step down as CEO in September, officially due to, quote, strategic differences with the board regarding future growth directions. His replacement was brought in from a competing firm with a mandate to rebuild client relationships and develop new service capabilities that could restore Pinnacle's market position. But the damage to both the company and Matthew's personal reputation was irreversible. Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, which had once been one of Portland's most respected consulting firms, was now seen as a cautionary tale about the importance of retaining innovative talent and properly crediting intellectual property development. Matthew himself had effectively been blacklisted from leadership positions in the Portland marketing community. His appropriation of my work, his misrepresentation of technical capabilities he didn't possess, and his failure to maintain client relationships had become well known throughout the industry. The last I heard, he was working as an independent consultant, struggling to build a client base without the institutional reputation and inherited advantages that had sustained his career for 2 decades. As I sat in my new office at Everly Innovations, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Mount Hood that rivaled anything Matthew had enjoyed at Pinnacle, I reflected on how completely the situation had reversed itself. The algorithm he had called garbage had become the foundation for a multi-million-dollar business. The employee he had dismissed and undermined had become a recognized industry expert whose innovations were transforming how companies understood their customers. Most importantly, the justice that had emerged from this situation wasn't something I had orchestrated or forced. It was simply the natural consequence of Matthew's decision to prioritize ego over excellence, control over collaboration, and short-term credit stealing over long-term value creation. He had taught me that talent without character is ultimately worthless, and that the most important business skill isn't technical expertise or strategic thinking. It's the wisdom to recognize and nurture the innovations that other people create, rather than trying to steal them for yourself. 3 years have passed since I walked out of Matthew Anderson's office with my resignation letter and a recording of him claiming credit for my intellectual property, and I'm writing this from my corner office at Everly Innovations, a company that now employs 78 people across 2 office locations and generates over $23 million in annual revenue. The algorithm that Matthew dismissed as complete garbage has been implemented by 247 companies across 14 different industries, and independent valuations now place its worth at $47 million. But more importantly, my name is on every patent, every presentation, and every piece of marketing material that describes how this technology works and why it's revolutionary. Last month, I received an email that perfectly encapsulated how completely the situation had transformed. David Chen, the fitness center owner who had been one of my first successful algorithm implementations back when I was still at Pinnacle, was writing to let me know that he was opening his 7th location and wanted to discuss expanding our analytics partnership to include predictive modeling for his entire franchise operation. Megan, his email read, I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for our business over the past 3 years. When I first met you, I had 3 struggling gyms and was spending a fortune on marketing that barely worked. Now I'm operating 7 profitable locations, and I understand my customers better than I ever thought possible. You've literally transformed how I think about business development. The message continued with a detail that made me smile. I was talking to another gym owner last week who mentioned that he used to work with some company called Pinnacle Marketing. He said their targeting system used to work great, but then it stopped performing and they couldn't figure out how to fix it. I told him he should call you directly. I hope that's okay. That email represented something much more significant than a satisfied client or a potential referral. It demonstrated the long-term consequences of Matthew's decision to steal credit for innovations he didn't understand, rather than nurturing the talent that created them. While my career had flourished and my algorithm had evolved into an industry-standard technology platform, his reputation had withered, and his company had lost the competitive advantage that had once set them apart from their competitors. But the real lesson of this story isn't about the satisfying downfall of someone who betrayed my trust and stole my work. The real lesson is about recognizing your own value and having the courage to walk away from situations where that value isn't appreciated, acknowledged, or fairly compensated. For most of my time at Pinnacle, I had been operating from a scarcity mindset that convinced me I should be grateful for any opportunity to prove myself, even when that opportunity came with the expectation that I would remain invisible and allow others to take credit for my contributions. I had internalized the message that challenging authority or demanding recognition was somehow unprofessional, that good employees focused on doing excellent work regardless of whether they received appropriate credit. That mindset kept me trapped in a situation where my innovations were being systematically appropriated while my career advancement was deliberately limited. I was so focused on not making waves and not causing trouble that I missed the obvious reality. I was working for someone who saw my talent as a resource to be exploited rather than an asset to be developed and rewarded. The transformation in my thinking began the moment I realized that Matthew's treatment of my intellectual property wasn't just unfair, it was unsustainable. He could steal credit for my past innovations, but he couldn't steal my ability to create future ones. By driving me away from Pinnacle, he was eliminating his access to the person who actually understood how predictive analytics worked and how they could be continuously improved to meet changing market demands. This realization led to what I now recognize as the most important career decision I've ever made: the choice to stop trying to succeed within someone else's limitations and start building something that would be entirely my own. But making that choice required overcoming several psychological barriers that I think many people face when they're dealing with toxic workplace dynamics or intellectual property theft. The first barrier was the fear of financial instability. Leaving Pinnacle meant giving up a steady salary, health insurance, and the security of working for an established company with predictable revenue streams. Joining Everly Innovations meant taking equity compensation that might be worthless if the company failed, working for a startup that could run out of funding, and risking my career on the belief that my innovations were valuable enough to build a business around. But I learned that financial security based on allowing others to exploit your work isn't actually security at all. It's dependency. As long as I remained at Pinnacle, my career advancement was entirely dependent on Matthew's willingness to acknowledge my contributions and provide opportunities for growth. Since he had already demonstrated that he saw me as a source of ideas to appropriate rather than a professional to develop, that dependency was actually a trap that would have limited my potential indefinitely. The second barrier was the fear of professional retaliation. Matthew had significant influence in Portland's marketing community, and I was concerned that challenging him or leaving his company under contentious circumstances might damage my reputation and make it difficult to find other opportunities. This fear turned out to be completely backwards. The people in our industry who mattered, the potential clients, collaborators, and investors who could actually impact my career trajectory, were far more impressed by my willingness to stand up for my intellectual property rights than they were concerned about maintaining good relationships with someone who had been stealing credit for other people's work. The third barrier was the most insidious: the internalized belief that I should be grateful for any recognition at all, even when that recognition was incomplete or misdirected. Matthew had been very effective at framing his appropriation of my work as mentorship, suggesting that my ideas were only valuable because of his strategic guidance and industry connections. Overcoming this psychological manipulation required me to honestly assess the source of the innovations that were driving Pinnacle's success. My algorithm wasn't successful because Matthew had provided strategic direction. It was successful because I had identified patterns in consumer behavior that nobody else had noticed and developed mathematical models sophisticated enough to predict those patterns in real time. Once I recognized that my contributions were the primary driver of the results that were transforming our clients' businesses, it became impossible to accept a situation where someone else was receiving credit for my intellectual property. The decision to leave Pinnacle and join Everly Innovations taught me that the most important career skill isn't technical expertise, strategic thinking, or even relationship building. The most important career skill is the ability to recognize when you're in a situation that's limiting your potential, and having the courage to seek out environments where your contributions will be properly valued. This lesson extends far beyond issues of intellectual property theft or workplace credit disputes. It applies to any situation where you're being asked to accept less than your worth, whether that's in terms of compensation, recognition, creative control, or professional development opportunities. I've learned that people who try to diminish your contributions or appropriate your work are usually operating from their own insecurities and limitations. Matthew's decision to steal credit for my algorithm wasn't really about me. It was about his fear that acknowledging my capabilities would expose the limitations of his own strategic thinking and technical understanding. But here's the crucial insight. Other people's insecurities and limitations don't have to become constraints on your own potential. When someone tries to minimize your contributions or take credit for your innovations, that's information about their character and their leadership capabilities, not about the value of your work. The most effective response to that kind of treatment isn't to fight harder for recognition within a system that's designed to exploit your talent. The most effective response is to remove yourself from that system and find or create environments where your contributions will be properly acknowledged and rewarded. This doesn't mean that every workplace conflict should result in resignation, or that every disagreement about credit and recognition requires dramatic confrontation. But it does mean that you should pay attention to patterns of behavior that suggest you're working for people who see your talent as something to be exploited rather than developed. If you're consistently finding that your ideas are being implemented without appropriate credit, that your contributions are being minimized in favor of other people's achievements, or that your professional development is being limited, because acknowledging your capabilities would threaten someone else's authority, those are signals that you need to seriously evaluate whether your current situation is compatible with your long-term career goals. The algorithm that Matthew called garbage has now been featured in Harvard Business Review, cited in academic research about consumer behavior prediction, and licensed by companies in 17 different countries. But more importantly, the experience of developing and protecting that intellectual property taught me lessons about professional self-advocacy that have influenced every decision I've made since leaving Pinnacle. I learned that innovation without ownership is just free labor for people who don't deserve it. I learned that talent without recognition is a resource that will be exploited until you decide to protect it. And I learned that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is refuse to participate in systems that are designed to diminish your contributions while amplifying other people's achievements. Today, Everly Innovations is recognized as one of the Pacific Northwest's most innovative marketing technology companies. We've been featured in Inc. magazine's Companies to Watch list, received the Portland Business Journal's Innovation Award for 3 consecutive years, and attracted Series B funding that valued the company at $180 million. My personal equity stake in the company is now worth more than I expected to earn in my entire career when I was still trying to succeed within Matthew's limitations. But the most satisfying aspect of this success isn't the financial rewards or the industry recognition. It's the knowledge that I'm working in an environment where innovation is properly credited, where talented people are given opportunities to develop their capabilities, and where success is built on collaboration rather than exploitation. I want to hear from you about your own experiences with workplace dynamics and professional recognition. Have you ever had someone try to take credit for your work or minimize your contributions? Have you found yourself in situations where you are producing excellent results but not receiving appropriate acknowledgement or advancement opportunities? How did you handle those situations, and what would you do differently if you faced them again? Please share your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and I often learn as much from your experiences as you might learn from mine. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I post new videos every Tuesday and Friday, covering everything from workplace strategy and career development to the latest innovations in marketing technology and consumer behavior analysis. More importantly, if you're currently dealing with a situation where your contributions aren't being properly valued or credited, I want you to remember that you have more options than you might realize. The skills, insights, and innovations that make you valuable to your current employer also make you valuable to other organizations that might be better positioned to recognize and reward your capabilities. The most important thing Matthew Anderson taught me, though certainly not intentionally, was that sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't revenge or confrontation. Sometimes the best response is to remove yourself from toxic situations and use your talents to build something better than what you're leaving behind. Your work belongs to you. Your innovations belong to you. Your career trajectory belongs to you. And you have the right to protect those assets from people who would exploit them without providing appropriate recognition or compensation. The algorithm that one person called complete garbage became the foundation for a business empire worth tens of millions of dollars. But that transformation only became possible when I stopped trying to succeed within someone else's limitations and started building something that reflected my actual capabilities and ambitions. Remember, the most important career skill isn't technical expertise or strategic thinking. It's recognizing your own value and having the courage to walk away from situations where that value isn't appreciated. Sometimes your greatest professional breakthrough comes not from fighting harder within existing systems, but from having the wisdom to recognize when those systems are designed to limit your potential. What would you do if someone tried to steal credit for your most important work? What would it take for you to have the courage to walk away from a situation that was limiting your potential? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video. Your ideas are worth protecting. Your contributions deserve recognition. And you have more power than you think to create the kind of career that actually reflects your capabilities and ambitions. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. 5 years after I walked out of Pinnacle Marketing Solutions for the last time, I found myself standing in the lobby of the very same building where my corporate nightmare had begun. But this time, I wasn't there as an employee hoping to prove my worth. I was there as the keynote speaker for the Portland Marketing Excellence Summit, delivering a presentation titled Innovation, Ownership, and the Future of Predictive Analytics to an audience of 800 industry professionals. The irony wasn't lost on me. The conference was being held in the same building where Matthew Anderson had once dismissed my algorithm as complete garbage, in the same city where he'd systematically stolen credit for my innovations, and to an audience that included many of the same people who had witnessed his appropriation of my work years earlier. As I waited in the green room before my presentation, reviewing notes for a speech that would discuss how my Apex algorithm had revolutionized customer behavior prediction across multiple industries, I received a text message that made me smile. It was from David Chen, the fitness center owner who had become one of my first success stories and had remained a loyal client throughout my entire journey. Watching your live stream from gym number 12, he wrote. Remember when you told me that good ideas deserve proper credit? You were right. Proud to have been part of your story from the beginning. Gym number 12. David now operated 17 fitness centers across 3 states, all of them using evolved versions of my predictive analytics technology to understand their customers and optimize their marketing strategies. His business had grown from 3 struggling locations to a regional fitness empire, and he had become one of Everly Innovation's most successful case studies. But David's message reminded me of something more important than business metrics or revenue growth. It reminded me that the decision to leave Pinnacle hadn't just been about protecting my intellectual property or advancing my career. It had been about ensuring that the people who trusted my innovations would continue to receive the technical support and ongoing development that their success required. If I had remained at Pinnacle, accepting Matthew's appropriation of my work and allowing him to position himself as the expert on technologies he didn't understand, clients like David would have eventually suffered when the stolen algorithm inevitably became outdated and impossible to maintain or improve. By having the courage to walk away from a toxic situation and build something better, I hadn't just protected my own interests. I had protected the interests of every business owner who was depending on genuine innovation rather than corporate theater. 20 minutes before my presentation, I decided to take a walk through the building's 42nd floor, past the office space that had once housed Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. The suite was now occupied by a digital marketing startup that specialized in social media strategy for local restaurants. Young, energetic professionals who reminded me of the person I had been when I first arrived in Portland, with big dreams and a suitcase full of naive optimism. As I stood in the hallway where I had once carried my cardboard box of personal belongings toward an uncertain future, I thought about Matthew Anderson and wondered what he was doing now. I'd heard through industry contacts that he was working as an independent consultant, struggling to rebuild a client base without the institutional advantages and stolen innovations that had sustained his career for so long. Part of me felt sorry for him, not because of the professional consequences he had faced, those were entirely self-inflicted, but because he would never experience the satisfaction that comes from building something genuine, something that reflects your actual capabilities rather than your ability to appropriate other people's work. The success I was about to present to 800 marketing professionals wasn't built on inherited advantages, stolen credit, or corporate politics. It was built on the simple recognition that good ideas deserve proper ownership, that innovation requires ongoing development and improvement, and that the most sustainable business advantages come from nurturing talent rather than exploiting it. As I walked toward the conference hall to deliver my keynote presentation, I realized that this building had become a symbol of transformation rather than trauma. The place where my corporate dreams had been shattered had become the place where I would share the story of how those broken pieces had been rebuilt into something stronger, more valuable, and entirely my own. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do to the people who hurt you. It's what you build from the ruins they leave behind. And sometimes, the most important lesson you can share with others is that your greatest setbacks often become your most powerful comebacks, as long as you have the courage to recognize your own value and refuse to let anyone convince you to accept less than you deserve. The algorithm that was once called garbage was about to be presented as a case study in innovation excellence to the largest marketing conference in the Pacific Northwest. That felt like exactly the right kind of ending. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Hi,